Thank you. Thank you. I'm really excited to talk about this research today. We've had a hard time getting babies in the lab for the last couple of years, but we're doing a lot better now. And so this research has taken a while, and it's all kind of come together just in time for me to give this talk. So I'm looking forward to telling you about it and getting some feedback. So initially, when I started this research, I was trying to contrast two kinds of learners. And so one sort of learner that we might be thinking about is essentially one who is a kind of a funhouse mirror of their input. And by that I mean that they simply are reflecting the statistical structure of the input that they're getting. So the most frequent and least variable aspects of the input are the ones that they are reflecting most readily. And so one property of this sort of learner is that they don't have any explicit linguistic grammar. And they also require quite a lot of input, because in order to mirror the input, they really need to have a lot over which to calculate or to reflect the statistics. The other possibility is is a learner who is actually observing their input and then coming away with some kind of an explicit, well, it's an implicit but independently represented representation of that input, which in the linguistics we would call a grammar. And this requires less input, and I think I'll make clear why that is over the course of the talk. But because they're not trying to reflect the sort of peaks and valleys of the input that they're getting, but they're drawing some kind of broader generalization, it requires less input. Okay, so how can we decide between these two kinds of learners? Well, as I've set it up, one way to do that is the amount of input required. Now, there have been debates about this for centuries, and in the domain of infant language learning for decades, and people have used different kinds of criteria to try to adjudicate between these two sorts of learners, whether or not they show evidence of generalization, but that doesn't seem to do a very good job. The kinds of generalizations that they can make, but it seems like both kinds of learners are able to do both kinds of things. I'm hoping that this criterion, the amount of input, does a little bit better job for us. And so we've already got quite a bit of evidence that infants are able to learn from a very small set of input. So they seem to be able to learn from a handful, so by that I mean 2 or 3 or 4 examples. There's also a lot of evidence at this point suggesting that infants count the input types that they're getting, so distinct examples, they count those a lot more heavily than they count tokens or the number of times they've heard a particular example. And this is accounted for a lot better within an evidence-based grammar acquisition model than it would be within a associative or sort of mirroring back the environment model. And then also, it seems like the logical structure of the input counts more than the amount. So a small amount of counter evidence, so for anybody who came to the talk that I gave in cognitive science a few weeks ago, I showed you that a small amount of counter evidence to what seems to be a statistically robust generalization is enough for the infant to rule out that generalization. So today I want to start with this idea that infants are able to learn from a very small amount of input and carry it even farther. And I want to ask the question, is less really more? So we know that a handful of input types is sufficient for learning. And by learning, what I'm talking about today is getting some input and making a generalization from that input. And the question that I want to ask today, though, is having a small amount of input as good as having a large amount of input, which would account for why babies are able to learn language so quickly? Or is it even possible that having a small amount of input is better than having a large amount of input? And that's definitely not predicted by the idea that we're just mirroring the statistics of our environment. So I'm actually going to talk about the confluence of 4 different factors today, but I'm going to start out telling you about 2 of them. So one of them is the idea that less is more. So Alyssa Newport, who is a pretty well-known language development researcher, proposed this theory a while ago, and here is a quote from a more recent paper. So that Hudson, Cam, and Newport say, one possibility for why children are better at generalizing from their input than adults, one possibility is that children are worse at directed memory search than adults. Another possibility is that children are less efficient at laying down memory traces, with the consequence that they have more difficulty retrieving specific forms. So essentially what they're proposing, and what Newport has been proposing in different forms for quite a while, is that younger learners have either a smaller working memory or they have a less efficient memory. And this actually does something really good for us if we're a younger learner. It helps us to learn language. And a number of people have been working on different sorts of computational models that include a smaller or a reduced memory and have looked at the consequences of that. And I'm going to do something similar today. So support for this point of view is, first of all, that children generalize more than adults do. So adults tend to, when exposed to a new language, so Newport has looked primarily at adults learning American Sign Language as later learners, that they seem to focus on a lot of what she calls frozen forms. That is, they pick up on the frequent forms of the language, but they don't generalize that structure to other forms. So children do. And there's also at least one study now showing that if you're trying to teach adults a language, and in this experiment it was a signed language, and you put them under memory constraints, so you make them remember some other kind of thing while you're teaching them the language, they actually generalize more, so they perform more like children. So that's an experimental confirmation of the kind of thing that Newport's talking about. The other theory that I want to join with the less is more idea is Bayesian inference, and actually next week's cognitive science talk is by Josh Tenenbaum, and Bayesian inference has become a very hot topic in a lot of areas, but also in my area in language development. So essentially the key points of Bayesian inference that I need to draw on today are that learners treat any input that they're getting as having been sampled from a larger population. So they're viewing what they got as some kind of a sample from a population. And they also view the larger population as having been generated by an underlying set of rules or principles. So there's a set of rules or principles for physics, biology, psychology, language, etc. And so the idea is that the experiences that you're having for any aspect of your world, you view as having been caused by some underlying system. And so essentially that's saying that in the domain of language, that children are assuming that the input that they're getting comes from some kind of a grammar. And so their job is to figure that out. So there's actually quite a bit of support for different aspects of children being able to use Bayesian inference. Here are just a couple. So infants, not in a language task, but in a task where infants are looking at ping pong balls and clear boxes, infants seem to be able to infer what the distribution of the population should look like from the sample that they've been given, and vice versa. And the example I just gave you a moment ago is that infants seem to change their generalization based on the logical structure of the input. So there are lots of other things that I could bring up here, but I won't. So these are the two pieces that I'm going to draw on today, the less is more hypothesis and Bayesian inference. So I'm going to tell you about a set of experiments, a couple of experiments with 11-month-olds and one with adults. And in these experiments, both infants and adults are presented with CV non-words. And the rule for the language is either that there's place harmony, so that the two consonants have to match in place of articulation, or they have to match in voicing. And So half of the participants in each of the 11-month-olds and the adults either hear 4 different words of this language, and they hear each word 6 times, so they get 24 words, but they're only getting 24 different words, or they're getting 24 different words. And it's clear that the idea that learners are mirroring their environment, they're mirroring the examples from their environment, predicts that they should do a lot better with getting 24 different words. Basically, any computer model that you'll run should do that. The participants, so right now I'm going to just talk about infants. They're 11-month-old infants, and I tested them using the head term preference procedure, and so I'm not going to show you the little movie because I've shown the little movie so many times, but basically the babies come into the lab, we put them in a tiny room with their parent who brings them in, and they sit on the parent's lap, and they listen, there's sounds coming out of speakers, and they listen to a familiarization phase for about 2 minutes. And then at test, they either get new items that are consistent with the pattern that they got during familiarization on some trials, or they get new items that are inconsistent with that pattern on other trials, and we're measuring the amount of interest they show on the consistent versus inconsistent trials. And they show interest by looking, as opposed to crying or playing with their feet or rubbing their head or anything like that. So adults, we don't do that with, but we familiarize them and we get grammaticality judgments from them. So it's kind of similar, but not exactly the same. So here are the stimuli from the experiment. And so the orange stimuli are the ones for the people who got just 4 words, so pota, tapa, biza, deva. And then all the words that are just in white, there are 20 of those, and they get added to the 4, so that makes the set of 24. And the green and the turquoise words are test items that they don't get during familiarization, but that are withheld and presented at test. Okay? And then the place rule stimuli have exactly the same structure. So poba, taza, bipa, desa are the 4 words, and then those plus all the 20 white ones are the 24, and again, green and turquoise are the test items that are withheld. So I had an intuition about how this worked, and I've been trying to explain it to people for months, because when you're running babies and you don't actually have any data, you go around and talk to people about what your data might look like, and so that's what I've been doing. And I was explaining it recently to my colleague in psychology, Rebecca Gomez, and she's saying, I don't know, and then I started explaining it more, and so she talked me into doing this little mini simulation. And it actually works so well that I thought I would show you, because I think it makes it clear what I think is going on here. So in the mini simulation, what I do is I take 12 random draws from the 4-word set, and I take 12 random draws from the 24-word set. So basically, I'm just going in, picking out 4 words or 24 words, and I'm okay. So, I'm taking those. But I'm taking them with memory limits. So I'm either taking draws 2 at a time, so I'm taking 2 out of the 4 words or 2 out of the 24 words, or I'm taking them 3 at a time, 3 out of the 24 or 4, or 3 out of the 24 or 3 out of the 4. Okay, so is that clear? So basically, what I'm doing is I'm saying, all right, I'm presenting babies or adults with either 4 words or 24 words, but let's assume that at least the babies have a limited memory. And I'm simulating that limited memory by only letting them look at either a pair of words or 3 words at a time to compare them to try to make a generalization. So they're not looking, they never look at the whole set of words, they're just looking at 2 or 3. Okay, does that make sense? All right. And then I'm including in this, I'm confessing up front that I'm including linguistic knowledge of an unknown source. So I'm looking at the draws that they get in terms of things like segments and the features that they contain. So for example, I'm counting all the features that match across the 2 or 3 items that I've chosen, so that the voicing is the same in C1 and C2, that both words end in ah, that both words are voice initial or voice final, that they're labial initial, that they're alveolar final. So this is a set of features that might be the same between 2 words that I've drawn from the set, okay? And so how learners come to know about these features is something that we might want to discuss. And then I'm also including Bayesian inference. And to do that, I'm saying, okay, so for every pair of words, I'm saying, well, okay, these 2 words share this particular set of features. Now, it could be that there's very little that they share, that they might only share the fact that they both end in ah, and that's the only thing that's similar about them. Or they might start in P and end in ah. But I'm saying, okay, so given that I believe that these items that I've been given here are a sample from a larger underlying population, and that underlying population was generated by a grammar, then I better take seriously the fact that these 2 words overlap in all these different ways. So it's not a coincidence that it's an important fact about these 2 words that they overlap in these ways. And so that's an assumption that you would make based on Bayesian inference. It's not an assumption that you would make based on the idea that you're just kind of getting features from your environment kind of willy-nilly. So here are the results of the mini simulation. And so with a memory size of 2, so you're just looking at 2 words at a time, or a memory size of 3, notice this really cool prediction, which I've had this intuition about for a while, and this is how it comes out. So if you have a word set of 24, so the y-axis is the mean consistent test words that the set of that the overlapping familiarization words would pick out. So it's basically saying how easy is it to generalize from familiarization to test. If you have a word set of 24 and you have a little memory of either 2 or 3, you actually generalize better if you only get 4 input words than if you get 24 input words, which is it fits this idea that I've had for a while, but now I've actually been able to make it work. And it turns out that if, for the set of words that I've got, 3 words actually will always get you the right test items all the time. You get the right set of features. Okay. So basically, what this is saying is that if you have a small memory, you actually can learn better. You can generalize better if you are generalizing from a smaller input set than a larger input set. So the question is that actually true for humans as opposed to an Excel simulation? So as I said, 11-month-old infants, they get familiarized in this head-term preference procedure. They're familiarized for 2 minutes and then they get tested. Because they're only getting 24 words, that's not very much time to get used to all this sound coming out of speakers and lights flashing that happens in this booth. And so they sit there for the first minute and a half and listen to Andean music, which they're very, very, very fond of. And then they hear 24 words. Again, those 24 words are either 4 different words repeated 6 times or 24 different words. And they get blocks of test words from each language. So if they were familiarized with voice, then voice test words would be consistent and place would be inconsistent. But if they were familiarized with place, then place would be consistent at test and voice inconsistent. And so, as I said before, we're measuring the time that they're listening to the consistent versus inconsistent test items. And here are the data. These are like some of the most cool data I've ever had. So if they get 4 input words, they listen longer, significantly longer to the consistent test items than the inconsistent test items. If they get 24 different input words, they don't learn. Isn't that the coolest thing ever? I love that result. We got this a while ago, and I was pretty excited about it. So it looks like they learned both rules. That's nice. But they only learned with the set of 4, not 24. So what seems, it's consistent with the idea that babies, first of all, have a limited memory. They're only able to look at a couple items at a time. But they're looking at those items with the idea that they are selected or sampled from some set that's generated by a grammar. And there's a nice computational model by Amy Perforce that does something very similar. But, of course, there's a possible confound that everybody I ever told about came up with when I told them, and that is that the word set of 4 had 6 repetitions. And so it might be that getting each word repeated 6 times made it easier to remember the word, and so then made it easier to figure out what the 4 words had in common. So it's a memory explanation, but it's not a very interesting one. It basically says if you repeat something enough, babies are likely to learn it. So it took me a while to decide that I was going to really go out on a limb and do this next experiment. So it works exactly the same way as the last one, but now I'm not giving them any repetitions. So they get 2 minutes of Andean music, which they like even better than 1.5 minutes of Andean music, and they just get the 4 words, but each word is, they just hear it once, that's it. So the question is, can they learn this rule from 4 words? So exciting. So everything else is the same, and they do. So I get a significant effect. And actually, the effect is even stronger than the last time. Although what's interesting here is, and if you're a careful observer, you'll notice that they actually show a preference for the inconsistent test items here as opposed to the consistent ones in the previous experiment. And generally speaking, in the infant learning literature, it's thought that you get a familiarity preference, that is listening to what's consistent, if you're still in the midst of learning the stimuli, and so you are not done yet, and so you want to listen to more of them, so you listen to what's consistent. And you get a novelty preference, that is listening to what's inconsistent with familiarization, if you've fully learned what you were exposed to and you're done with it. And so if that's the case, it's surprising that babies actually learn better from just 4 words only once than 4 words repeated. But I actually think it makes a kind of sense, and there are 2 ways that it might make sense. The first way is that when the infants heard 4 words, but each one repeated 6 times, they actually needed to determine if what they were hearing were new words. So were they the same as a word they'd heard before? So were they just different tokens? Or were they hearing different types? So they were actually trying to figure out how much data they were in fact being given, and that might have made the task harder. A kind of more interesting explanation that's based on the model that I've been presenting is that the babies in experiment 1 were given the words in blocks. So they'd get the 4 words, and then they'd get the 4 words again in a different random order, and then a different random order, and different random order. And there was no repetition. There was no immediate repetition, but there was repetition at a distance. So they might, for example, hear the first block would be Deva, Poda, Biza, Tapa, and then the next block might be Poda, Tapa, Deva, Biza, and notice that Tapa is there twice in that little window of 3. So if babies are taking in information 3 words at a time, they're actually getting less information when they're getting repeated items than when they're not getting repeated items, because they're hearing it in this continuous stream. So I think one of these 2 explanations might explain why it was actually easier to learn from just 4 different words than it was to hear the words repeated. Okay, so where we are now is that infants can learn both the place and voice harmony rules just from 4 unrepeated input items, which is really amazing when you think about it. I mean, here they've learned this, pretty plausible, quasi-plausible linguistic rule from just 4 words. They can't learn it from 24 words, which I think is really cool. And so the way I'm thinking about it is that it supports the confluence of the less is more hypothesis, saying that babies have a reduced working memory, and some form of rational learner Bayesian inference, plus another factor that I'm going to tell you about at the end. So let's move on to adults and compare infants to adults, because remember that the less is more hypothesis was proposed to account for the fact that babies seem to learn, babies and children generalize more readily than do adults. So adults heard the 24 words, so either the set of 4 repeated 6 times or 24 different words. And to make it even a little bit interesting for them, they saw the word, they heard the words while looking at pictures of aliens sitting around a fire. Not that interesting, but not bad. And they were told that they were listening to an alien language. And at test, they heard each word, and then they saw their familiar aliens or new aliens, and they had to say who they thought said the word. It made it more interesting. So here's what we found. So basically, if you look at the place rule, they didn't learn it at all, and I have sent out many pleading emails to members of the faculty in linguistics who do sound, asking why this is the case, and I think I understand it. But they did learn the voice rule, and they learned it in both the 4-word and the 24-word condition, although the effect is larger in the 24-word condition. So if anything, they went the opposite direction of the babies, which is what you might predict given less is more. Okay, so adults only learn the voice rule. The learning is more robust, as I said, with 24 examples, although they learned it in both. And thanks for, I think, Diana, who turned me on to Stefan Frisch's work. So it turns out, this was really disappointing, that English actually avoids place harmony. So we don't like to have words like dut, for example, that shares place. So if you look back at the pattern of responses with that in mind, you can actually partially account for the finding just by thinking that adults were avoiding place harmony. So the arrows here are pointing to the items that showed place harmony. So they're the inconsistent items in the voicing condition and the consistent items in the place condition. And so basically for 3 out of the 4 conditions, all but the one on the farthest left, adults were just giving a lower rating to items that shared place. And so that just reflects their knowledge of English, probably. But I do think that it's important to note that it's not, that won't explain all of the findings, because in the voicing condition, sure, they're rating the place harmony items lower, but if all they were doing was responding based on their dislike of place harmony items, then you should have seen the same pattern of response all the way in every condition, because they were just saying, don't like place, don't like place, don't like place, don't like place. And so it looks like what's going on here is that adults in the voicing rule, that they're learning in both conditions, but that what they're doing is sort of pooling the learning that they did in the experiment with what they know about English, and that's accounting for how they respond. So the overall summary here is that infants learn both rules. They only learn from the small number of examples. Adults seem to learn the voice rule, and they do somewhat better with 24 examples. The infant data, as I've been saying, support the confluence of a memory constraint and Bayesian inference. And the adult data, this is what I was just trying to say, suggests that they're engaged in something like similarity-based learning. So they're saying, okay, I just had this experience in the lab, I've heard 24 words, and then I've had 19 years of experience with English, and so I'm just going to pool those. So in the case of the voicing rule, that sort of stood out and they were able to pick the right items. But in the case of the place rule, they had this recent experience with 24 words, but then they'd had this lifetime of learning English, which kind of swamped out what they learned about the place rule in the experiment. Okay, so the unstated factor is that if you looked at the words that I showed you from the two rules, they came from the diagonal. The orange items came from the diagonal of the table. And so they are maximally informative and have minimal overlap. So basically, they're a really good representation of the set of stimuli generated by the grammar. So is that cheating, or is there some reason to think that that's a good thing to have done? And so another piece of this puzzle that I'd like to bring in is that there's pretty new work on an area called natural pedagogy. And for those of you who haven't heard about it, which is probably most of you, I really encourage you to take a look, because I think it has a lot to offer, or at least a lot of, it offers some interest for people thinking about how language might be learned. So the idea of natural pedagogy is that adults, and there have been several experiments here, where adults are able to select examples, not in a language domain, but in domains where people have to guess some kind of spatial arrangement or form a category. So adults are able to select examples that are maximally informative for training other adults, and the adults who get these examples when the teacher is really in the teacher mode learn better. And it also seems there's a very cool new study out. Well, it's from 2011 by Sage and Baldwin, showing that babies are really able to determine when somebody is in a mode, a teaching mode, a pedagogical mode, and they approach the input that they're getting from that person differently than they do. They learn more quickly, they consider fewer possibilities than if they don't think that the adult is in a teaching mode. So I think that there's some really interesting ways that we might think of applying this to linguistics. And I also suggest there's a Shafto, Goodman, and Frank article that I think they actually talk about linguistics a little bit. So I suggest you look at that. Okay, so what we're doing right now to see that it's the fact that we selected these really well-chosen examples for babies to learn from versus just learning from any 4 examples is we're looking at, we're giving a new set of 11-month-olds 4 words, but the 4 words are clustered, so we're just pulling them from the upper left corner of that table that you saw. And so there's a lot of overlap. So 2 of the words start with the same consonant, and 2 other ones share the same vowel. So there's a lot more overlap among the words than there was in the original experiment. And we've only got a few babies now, but it looks like they can't learn it. So it's not just 4 words, but it's 4 well-chosen words that seem to do the trick. So as I was saying, I really think that this area of, so you could either look at what I've done as massive cheating, which I would discourage you from doing, or that this is, if we can make this idea pan out for how babies are actually presented with linguistic input, that it might be the case that they're actually getting a nice sample of the input that might allow them to learn it with a very few input examples. So I'm thinking, for those of you who are interested in L2, I think that there's an interesting L2 experiment in here someplace. Okay, so, oh, this is going to be fun. We have plenty of time. So the last thing I want to say, and kind of how I'm thinking about this whole set of work and where I'm going in the future, is kind of thinking about there being these different factors that come into language learning that create what I'm calling a perfect storm. So working memory limitations, I think that there's pretty good evidence now that that if you build working memory limitations into a computational model, you can actually get a lot of mileage out of it. So, and I've shown something similar. What we don't have right now is nobody's gone out and actually tested babies to say, well, how big is their memory? And that's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's a worthwhile thing to do, so that's something that I'm probably going to be working on. Then another component of the perfect storm is that we have a rational learner. So, and in particular for me, what the rational learner has to be doing is treating the set of features that overlap between 2 or 3 items. They have to treat that as a suspicious coincidence that needs to be investigated. So they have to treat the complete set of overlap as one that needs an explanation in the grammar. One that I've mentioned, but I think really deserves more mention here, is that I've assumed that the learner is sensitive to relevant units, segments, features, and where that comes from, whether that can actually be something that they learn or whether that actually has to be the innate linguistic component in a system like this, is up for grabs. But I think that even if we have to say, all right, this is what's innate to the learner, I think that would be it would really help us to narrow down what it is about language that might be innate, that it's the units that we, in terms of, that we think about language in terms of. So segments, features, subjects and predicates, and I won't venture into any farther territory, but I think that this is a really interesting question to ponder, putting it in the context of this other stuff. And then finally, the fourth component of what I think of as the perfect storm is a representative sample of the input. So a sample of the input that gives you a sense of how big the hypothesis space needs to be with minimal overlap. And again, that's a question that we need to answer, whether or not infants are getting that kind of input and whether adults are intentionally or unintentionally giving it to them. And that's something that I'm going to work on. So that combination, though, in what I've shown you, allows for really, really rapid convergence. 4 examples on the right, linguistic generalization by, pretty young learners, so 11-month-olds. So that is it, and I thank all of these people and Carolyn and NSF. I want to keep thanking NSF, and thank you.